So this talk's called Prevent Default, the future of authoring tools. And this is my first time on stage, so if you guys boo me off stage, I'm never doing it again. Hello. So who am I? My name is Mihai Cernusca. I call myself a creative, but the past 15 years I've mostly been writing code. I flew here from Brooklyn, where I've been for the past couple of years. And I was born in Romania and spent half my life there. So that means I didn't really get to experience the internet until 2001, which is modern times already, but not quite for the web. And I really became quite obsessed with figuring out how the internet works. And for the next 7 years, I spent a lot of time building educational tools, working with a local university, building a lot of content management systems. And then post-Web 2.0, social networking and that kind of stuff. And I'm telling you this not because I just want to show you my work, or I actually think it's relevant to what we're talking today. And that's because the state of the web around that time, around 2006, 2007, when PHP basically tried to become Java, basically I lost all interest in the web and just went to art school. And this is Sam, one of my characters. And then I graduated, and again, the industry just collapsed, and I was kind of stuck. Like, do I go back to web development? Do I continue and do something else? And luckily, the iPhone came out, and like, how can you not really get into that? It was like brand new. And because it was from the beginning, even though I didn't see myself as a programmer, I was able to basically jump in and do a lot of work for the next 5, 6 years. And I picked Gift Shop here, which was mentioned in the intro. And it was really a side project. It was not one of my commercial projects, but it's my favorite project because there was a lot of, it was not a very specific, we didn't know exactly what to build, but it was open enough to where people could do anything with it. So people took advantage of that, and I was very surprised at how creative people were with something that basically gives you just a way to stitch frames together. And this was before the time of Vine or anything, so like, there was no indication that anybody would actually want to use this. And now, for the past couple of years, I joined my brother to build a web application again. So what changed was React basically made me think that the kind of, and what kind of scared me away from web development before, was sort of the complexity of it. So with React, it just seemed like maybe now we can build sort of professional level tools on the web. So Swipe is a presentation tool. We're trying to take the presentation beyond the projector. And it came out of sort of a frustration with how we use our tools today, right? We're not quite taking advantage of them as being computers, as machines. We're just sort of using them to simulate paper, right? So this talk is called The Future of Authoring Tools, and I want to define what authoring tools means first. And you might want to think about it as productivity tools. You might think of it as content creation tools. And I wanted to play a short clip from Steve Jobs, that kind of, where he tries to put a definition to what they were trying to do back in the early 80s.
But where we're trying to get is we're trying to get away from programming. We've got to get away from programming because people don't want to program computers. People want to use computers. And so our strategy right now is let's write some programs that are generic, that sort of will write 90% of the program and you fill in the last 10% of the blanks. A perfect example of that's a word processor. A word processor can be used to write a business letter, a report for a college exam. It can be used to write a correspondence letter to your friend. Same word processor. We write it once, millions of people use it. Another program, there's a lot of database programs. There's some spreadsheet modeling programs where we do 90% of the work, you do the other 10.
So the personal computing industry at the time was in this situation where they didn't have a use for a computer. So, there's no internet, you can't stream TV on it. All the computer could do was crunch numbers. So they had to come up with ways of making these computers useful, and they started with office automation as a way to introduce them. And they were really seen as office appliances. They're not seen as something somebody would necessarily want to use. It's just sort of something that's there that can automate a lot of things. So we can think of it as the future of generic tools. And he mentioned word processing, and I want to start with that because a lot of the web is text, and a lot of the tools we use in general are around text. And of course, word processing did not start with computers. It started with typewriters, and this typewriter will actually do type checks, dictionary checks, and actually beep at you if you made an error. And then once it was brought to the computer, which is on the Xerox Alto here, this is Bravo, the first what you see is what you get word processor. It basically mimicked exactly what the electromagnetic typewriter was doing. And we see the Alto had a vertical screen to basically match the piece of paper that it was then going to be transferred to. And later with the Star, we get images, and this basically continues on to Windows with Word and modern Word. And then it's been basically the most the most popular program in the world, really. And it's described as number 2 pencil of the digital age, which is basically a very standard pencil in the US. I'm not sure if that exists here. So then we get to the web, and Google Docs is basically Microsoft Word ported to the web. But when it came out, this really blew, I think, everybody's mind, that you could have something that's desktop quality on the web. And this caught my attention, and I tried to reverse engineer it, and it just seemed like magic, right? And it took me a very long time to figure out basically what they're doing. And that's only because other people basically did the hard work of figuring out how it works. So the iPhone comes out, and things kind of start to change a bit. And we have Quip, which takes into account that we don't share these documents only on PCs anymore. Like, the context kind of changes. You could be on a phone, you could be on a tablet or a PC. And 2 years later, again, Dropbox starts experimenting with what is the future of word processing. And they're really focusing on collaboration. So I don't think it's going to be any surprise that at a web conference, I'm going to say that the future of authoring tools is the web. And the web browser has evolved, and it has defined the devices of today. I think the most defining characteristic of the iPhone is that it brought a real web browser to the mobile world, which was huge. And it has grown because of the web, not because of sort of the applications that I was writing. So I want to ask what the web is for, and I found this newsletter at the Microsoft booth, and I thought it was quite perfect. So it says it's got universal reach and doesn't belong to anyone. So there's this kind of utopian aspect of the web that we all love. And this is the first web browser that Tim Berners-Lee put out. And the one thing we want to notice is this is actually both an editor and a web browser. So the web, from the beginning, has this collaborative idea built in to where anybody should be able to put anything out, and anybody should be able to access it. But it does sort of mimic what word processing was at the time. So the technology, it's a lot of text. It took them a while to have images, and that was a very controversial thing. And something happened with, like in the early mid 2000s, with going from this read-only web mode that the modern web sort of evolved into a sort of collaborative spirit again. And I think that's important. That was an important shift, even though a lot of the interactions were very insignificant. You know, we have like buttons, we can comment, we contribute back to the web, we can post things in different silos like Flickr and Facebook and whatever we have now. But a lot of what computers enable us to do is communicate across time and space, really. So really, they're significant because they make us better communicators. So the web is for communicating. And Engelbart at one point said that, and Douglas Engelbart is basically the inventor of human-computer interaction. He is the visionary that saw that computers could be more than computing machines. And he thought almost everything important has consequences in the adult world is done by adults working together. And this is what's called the mother of all demos in 1968, so way before that Steve Jobs clip that I showed you. And that's Engelbart in the top left. And he's demonstrating word processing, collaborative word processing over the network with real-time video. And he's also the inventor of the mouse, so this is the first time you see a mouse. And now we're seeing a shift we're seeing desktop software come to the web. And this is Airtable. It's an adaptation of Microsoft Access, which used to run only on your computer. But the important thing is the use cases that you can, the usefulness of this tool on a network with other people is much higher than what it would be for you yourself on your computer, just building a tool for yourself. So I want to look at the web browser as a universal meta platform, and I call it a meta platform just because there is no browser. There's a lot of browsers. It's sort of a conceptual platform. And we have even software like Figma, which is very unlikely to come to the web because it is a graphical design tool, right? So the CEO saw the potential of the web as a communication platform, and he saw design as a communication exercise. So Alan Kay, which later worked at Xerox PARC and is the father of the graphical user interface, says that one of the mistakes that we made with the web is that it should have been a mini operating system. It shouldn't, and then the people who made the browser mistook it for an application, which is why we have basically Word on steroids. And what he envisioned was basically what Engelbart had done before him, which is a globally connected network where our operating systems operate at that level. So if we accept that the potential of a computer is to be that at the operating system level, where it's not just a window we log into that serves us documents that we then abuse to build applications on top of, how you empower basically non-technical creators and not lose the collaborative aspect of the web. So Bruce Horns, he worked at Apple and is responsible for Finder, but he made it his life's mission to empower creators on computers. And I think that's a good mission. I think that when I look at my previous work, that's been the main motivation, is how do you empower people to be creative? How do you empower people to communicate? And the only answer is really, on computers at least, is through smarter tools. So I want to talk about if the future of authoring is on the web, or at least targeting the web in the short term, how can we think of it as a document? And really, you have to think of it as a website. So it has the same characteristics. So it's going to be universally accessible. It's going to be multimedia, fluid or responsive. It's going to be semantic, and it's going to reduce to plain text. So if we're going to build tools for the browser to create these documents, we're going to have to be able to deal with editing text. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So today, the blocks of interaction that when you get to a website and you want to interact with something related to text, you get something like this. It's a text area. We've also built tools like content management systems to empower people to build websites. And it looks something like this, of course, more modern ones, Squarespace, Tumblr. And it's really the only Lego bricks we have to use are these forms, right? So you can really reduce most web applications to something like this, which is templarized forms. And if you take this to an extreme, you can look at 3D software and how you can build very complex things out of very generic controls that have no real meaning built into them. They just have this very specific behavior, and this is not very good UI, right? So a lot of the frustration of using 3D software is having to deal with these kind of UIs. But 3D software also has a lot of very expressive and powerful UIs, and you can edit things in multiple ways and see data in multiple ways. And I think this is sort of the direction we should look at. And this is back to the content management systems I worked on. What the main element on this page that creates the page is really this rich text control, which, if you've worked with rich text going back for a long time, you know all the frustrations that comes with that. So what do I mean by rich text? We can think of it as styling text, but you can also think of it as more subtle, error prompts like this. It's like a very visual way of showing you what you did wrong. This is a Hemingway app. It checks your writing and tries to warn you about using the wrong language or too long or not readable enough. So I really want you to think of it as attributed text, which is a string with a set of attributes on every character. And that we'll come back to that later. But Containable is really at the core of both modern and sort of older ones. This is the only control we have over the browser when it comes to inputting anything other than plain text in those forms. So it becomes very important going forward, since this is the only control we have, that we use it in a smart way. So this is from one of the specs. Containable is basically considered too complex and buggy. So part of the reason is, and then we find a lot of clever ways to avoid it, which is BB code and Markdown. And this is the editor that built the slide. But it's all just HTML. So we're just disguising HTML, which is not enough, really. So I want to go over a quick history of the rich text editors. And the only thing I want you to focus on is the dates, which is basically every year there's been some major rich text editor that's come out. And I want to focus on basically what's changed since the beginning, which was in 2003. Oops, I guess not. Sorry. So what's changed is in here. So we've gone from what you see is what you get HTML editor, which is what we had back in 2004. We switched to what you see is what you mean editor, which that means we now have a semantic model backing the editor itself. And otherwise, nothing's happened until basically React came out, and now we have quite a bit of activity, trying to do this in React. And the thing that's changed in the past few years is that now they're called a framework as opposed to a content editor or a text editor. So I was in the situation of having to come up with a way to do rich text in React. And I came up with this, which is a port or inspired by Tricks, which was done at Basecamp. And after I got far enough to basically interact with it, I realized that this is not at all what I need in order to build the kind of tools that I want to build. So I built it before I figured out what I needed. And then when we look at sort of a zoomed out view of the graphical representations of all these editors over the years, it's really, what you'll find is that nothing's really changed in terms of what they do. And they all remind me of sort of Word for Windows, like 1.0. So what we're really doing when we put these in our applications is we're basically embedding Word to some degree. And the problem is that we're taking something that's a form now and calling it a framework because you can sort of interact with it with an API. And we're building applications within this, right? So to understand the issue is we have to look at what an input control does for us, and it maintains a lot of state. There's history, there's cursor navigation, there's cut, copy, and paste. So it's a lot of interaction and behavior and a lot of state. And we know from React that really we should be sort of in charge of this state and not, it's very hard to interact with a one-way data flow if your form controls are basically managed by the browser. So the other issue is the way Containable works is basically it takes a text editing model, and then you have variables sized lines, including for images. So the cursor navigation basically is that of a text editor. So how is Containable different from a text editor then? The difference is when you try to insert a new line, for example, you're not managing a string, you're managing a structure. So we ideally want to think of it as each one of these text boxes, we would want to think of it as a separate input, right? If that was a separate content editable, we're in a world where they didn't have to interact with each other, that would be a lot simpler because we know how to turn a data model into how to render this document, and we know how to deal with forms. The problem is, and that's sort of how these text editors work, but the problem is when you get more complex layouts, the text editing model starts to fall apart, right? And we kind of know this from when we try to use Word. So we're trying to build direct manipulation interfaces for editing structured documents. And we should have learned our lesson with Word. Basically, the text editor model does not scale for structured data. So as soon as you add layout to it and you have more than a vertical layout, it's very hard to manage it because you can't see the structure, so how can you manipulate it? If the structure is invisible to you, there's nothing you can do. You can only infer what's going to happen. So if you have two-column text, it's very hard to control what's going on. So this tweet was kind of a reaction to that. So the feature of authoring tools is probably not a word processor. And Don Norman, what he had to add about how to manage complexity is that complexity is a part of life. And if the structure is revealed and understood, then complexity fades away. So I think the problem is the level of abstraction that we're dealing with. So we need a more fundamental building block for rich text. So we want to think of these as, at least logically, as separate inputs, the H1 and the paragraphs. And we want to find a way to build applications with these. So we have to think of what other ways of managing data that we have from previous experiments. And one of the other ways to manage data is, besides word processing, is an outliner, which actually does manage structured data. And it's basically for hierarchical data, but we actually see it with Doug Engelbart. If you look in the top right, he's actually managing an outline in his word processor. And this is a modern version of something like that, which works sort of like a text editor, but each of those lines is an individual input. But the cursor navigation is maintained between lines. But you have a lot more, you have a visibility in the structure, and you can actually move things around a lot more easy than you would in a text editor where all you have is cut, copy, and paste. And a better example, I think, of what I'm talking about is Notion, which, again, you can see as they select the different blocks, they're independent units. So they're building an editor out of sort of different Lego blocks, which is very interesting. And just like an outliner, you can drag and reorder them out, and it's a very powerful sort of interaction system. But what they're doing, even more interestingly, is that this is not just a document. This is actually a platform that you can build fairly complex tooling on. So this is a sort of a recreation of Trello, a task board. You have a collaborative document that has stateful controls like checkboxes. You have layout. You have graphics. There's buttons, there's a lot of these controls. So these are the building blocks for applications that you could build fairly complex workflows on top of. And this is what they started out with. And I don't think you can see, but the one thing that was interesting to me is that it says anyone can read or write in real time. Web pages aren't documents, they're shared spaces. And it's that way of looking at the web that really led them to this product, which I think is quite powerful. For my own application, this is what I'm currently exploring, and it's a way of keeping what we currently have with Markdown, which is very productive input of text and very easy manipulation, and trying to build a visibility around the layout around it, which is something you can't do in Markdown very easily without very ugly kind of extensions to it. So I want to talk about the price of working with these systems. And I want to go back again to what does input control do for us. And basically, we want to keep everything that's behavior from these controls, but we'll have to implement the state ourselves. So history, input state, we'll have to keep a track of the selection. And that's a lot of work, right? Because there's very few real applications on the web. And this is the progression I've sort of seen from simulating paper in web applications to this collaborative environment to this basically a platform for empowering non-technical users to build workflows on top of. But we shouldn't think that we sort of have the answers for what the web could be. This is Ted Nelson. He's credited to have invented a hypertext. And he saw back in the 70s, software is more like a game, is more open-ended than these like very rigid structural that the software we create today imposes. So to conclude, I want to say that the future authoring tools will target the web, have an interaction model somewhere closer to an outliner than a word processor, and it'll change the way we see documents. And I want to talk in my last 20 seconds about Doug Engelbart, who passed away 4 years ago. And he felt that he had failed, right? So I think we have an opportunity. I think the web is at this inflection point that personal computing was in the early 80s. We have to decide what the web and computing as a platform can be. And the process of imagining what these tools can be is super important. And it's important to remember that none of us were born knowing how to write software. So as web application developers, we need to study the past and share the knowledge so we can actually build and define what we want these tools of the future to be. And I'll conclude with Doug's words, and the better and better we get at getting better, the faster will we get better. Thank you.
Woo! Thank you so much.